My presentation, called Upping the Ante on Restoration, deals with landscape scale restoration on travelling stock reserves. The issue is complex and there are lots of numbers and graphs in my presentation, but the important part is going to be the last two slides that I'll present about how we get stuff done on a big scale and in a sustainable way that doesn't have too much resource allocation, that can be expanded and occur across large areas, get big uptake, but we can move things in a positive way and spend less and less time on them, because the sort of areas I'm going to be talking about are huge. The issues are no less, and success is a long way off, but it's achievable. Different from most, this particular project was a part-time exercise by 8 TSR rangers and me providing part-time technical advice and having contractors doing some of the work. What are TSRs, travelling stock reserves? Well, they're New South Wales' huge and hidden asset. Travelling stock reserves were set up from the mid-18th century, and they were primarily to allow stock to be moved from grazing areas to markets, along river valleys and through prime agricultural land, and that is one of the key elements of what makes TSRs. And they're made up of routes, which are the wide continuous strips of land, so anyone driving in through the inland will see fences a long way away from the roadside and probably wonder, oh, isn't this a lovely roadside? Well, they're the routes, and they're often along roadsides. And then the reserves. The reserves are standalone areas, and they can vary from tens of hectares to many hundreds of hectares. And that's where stock could shelter and water overnight. And basically they're located roughly 8 to 10 kilometres apart. And that was deemed the area that the distance that a cow or a sheep could travel in a day without putting it through undue stress. Why TSRs? Why work on those? Well, they retain a high level of the region's original vegetation, wherever you are, and provide excellent opportunities for both restoration and rehabilitation. And the reason they are that way is because they generally have not been cropped or had superphosphate added to them. They weren't systematically cleared like most of the agricultural areas, and they've had mostly only temporary, albeit very heavy at times, grazing. And they're often the best examples of those vegetation types that occur on fertile soils left. And there's the key element again, the fertile soils. In effect, most of this country has otherwise been cleared for agriculture. They provide habitat for many threatened species and vegetation communities, and they're amongst the best options there are for buffering and protecting wildlife across inland landscapes from the worst impacts of climate change. Many of the region's threatened species are reliant on TSRs, and I've got two examples there. Pictures from my friend Chris Zaros of superb parrots and grey crowned babblers, just quite typical of the species found there. TSRs in the Riverina are vital for the foraging habitat for that Riverina superb parrot population, and the inland grey box and grassy black box woodlands on TSRs are home to the main concentration of grey crowned babblers in southern Australia. You'll probably gather by my talk that I talk a lot about wildlife. I'm a wildlife biologist, and I happen to get interested in vegetation and habitat because they've got to live somewhere and they've got to eat something. So it seemed pretty important to understand what the hell it was. Anyway, the aim of it is to achieve small but significant change over a large area, landscape scale, across a range of site types and conditions, with an effort to inspire others that it's something that can be done on a grand scale. As we know, restoration actions are usually based on intensive works on one or two sites and often involves huge resource and time commitment. The breadth of this project, however, requires a high degree of planning, experience and total buy-in by the land manager, and that is the critical part. The land manager has to be actively involved at all levels. And when you're dealing across a large landscape, it's important to use accepted and consistent methods and approaches. So for this particular project, we did the vegetation using Benson's typing, and wars have been over vegetation typing. I don't want to get stuck into it, but it's just that seemed a good alternative, and most people could understand it. I certainly could. And we used a system which was Thackway and Co.'s the VAST, the Vegetation Assessment State and Transition, a modified version of that for condition rating, habitat rating. And the key element of that, it made sense to land managers because it actually put, for example, at the lower end, it meant that you were full-on rehabilitation where you were starting from scratch up to where there was a slight effort on assisted regeneration. I might say I found the Commonwealth EEC Endangered Ecological Community technical notes and the state ones really helpful. They gave a lot of good background to the actual the state that we were looking at and the comparison states, and we were also we called on the local revegetation guides, which I think Jill's going to follow me after the break and talk about the value of those in areas and using those to guide your species selection. This was a 6-year grant funded from 2012 until 2016. We're in the 5th year of it, by the Commonwealth via, oh God, they've got so many different changes, biodiversity grant and more lately carbon farming initiative, and I'm not sure what it's called now, but it's going. Anyway, why the Riverina bioregion? Why the hell did I work there? It's a relatively poor map, unfortunately. The northern area is north of the Lachlan River, and the southern part is the Murray River with the Murrumbidgee in between, so it gives you an idea of the scale. And in the east is east of Narrandera, and in the west is out to Balranald. So a very large area. Anyway, it's one of the most cleared landscapes. So unfortunately, the southwest slopes is just on the eastern edge. So it's mainly the flat country, as Martin tells me. Make sure that I give that a boost. The green are the travelling stock reserves. It has 600 or over 600 TSRs covering an area of 128,000 hectares, which is roughly 20% of the TSRs in New South Wales. The habitat types differ from national parks and other conservation reserves because they're on fertile soils that have otherwise been cleared and converted to agriculture. And consequently, they're the home to many threatened species and endangered ecological communities. So basically, I looked at 251 TSRs. You can probably gather it was a rapid assessment technique. Of those, 108 were selected for monitoring, and the chart that you see on your left, it gives a rundown on what TSRs contained endangered ecological communities. So the blue had 81 or 76% of the sites that we monitored contained endangered ecological communities. Of those 81, the purple was inland greybox, which it's the largest extent of this EEC, often in the best condition in southern Australia. The dark blue is the Boree or Weeping Mile, and extensive areas of this EEC are throughout the plains in the central Riverina. The green are Gilgai endangered ecological communities, and they're a subset of the riverine plains grasslands, generally found south of Billabong Creek, around the Urana and up to Jerilderie area. And just a note, that EEC has a number of threatened plants species in it. The yellow are the bull oak woodlands, which now are mostly on private land and consist of scattered mature trees with no regeneration, and they're often amongst crops because it occurs on good draining cropping country. The red is a small area of boxgum woodland which was on the edge of the southwest slopes. And there are several state endangered ecological communities, including Pine Hill woodlands, which is the light blue, and Yarran shrublands. You can see they're relatively important. So inland grey box, Weeping Mile, just to get you in the sense of things, Riverina grasslands, which are absolutely fantastic in spring, but you wouldn't know it otherwise, and bull oak woodlands. Implementation. To do something at this scale with limited resources, you've got to be pretty judicious about how you're going to go and do things. The key parts of the project were to identify suitable sites, the whole of TSRs or part, develop practical site plans, promote natural regeneration wherever possible, reintroducing missing elements, and the key one quite often was palatable woody plants by direct seeding from locally sourced plants. Develop preferred grazing to promote the species you want and control exotic species biomass, because as I said, these areas are very fertile, and you add rain and they grow prodigious amounts of grass. And lastly, controlled the main impacts, including pest plants and animals. Monitoring. So of the 251 TSRs, most of them have one permanently marked photo point, and it's usually located to monitor something that's important, like, for example, grazing sensitive plants. Regular monitoring of these enable a land manager to make decisions that can influence habitat condition improvements. So it's vital that the rangers know what the condition of the reserves are before and after travelling stock around. Actually, cattle, or primarily cattle and sheep, can be useful as long as they're done and managed in an appropriate way, short term, with a lot of stock and at the right times, and then long spell periods to let those plants you want regenerate. 108 TSRs are being assessed twice. The first round's I've just completed, and the next round will happen next year to determine habitat change. 80 bird sites have been established using Bird Australia's benchmarking technique, and they're looking at monitoring long-term changes to bird communities as a surrogate for habitat condition and change. Demonstrable change. Of the 108 reserves, that's what the pie chart's about, the blue, 43 of those had positive change. Moving around red, the sites had showed some improvement, but because they were, for example, the regrowth or the shrub seedlings were still small, that you couldn't be sure that they'd passed the vagaries of drought or grazing. They were still in the watch it basket. The green, they were already high conservation value sites, which was much more about maintenance of their current condition. And the yellow were the ones that showed no positive change. Of the 43 sites that showed positive changes, the key elements of that was increased natural regeneration of trees and shrubs on the left. That's 35 of the 43 sites. And by this, we're not talking one or two plants, we're talking across significant areas of the reserves. Successful shrub germination, and we called successful once they were greater than 50 centimetres. 32 of the 43 sites were that way. Improved ground layer, less weeds and less pests were observed on some of the reserves. I got with the times and did a recovery wheel on one of the better sites, and this was a site called Kareen TSR, and it's a site that's had active management with respect to controls of grazing and weed control since 2002, and more latterly in this project from 2013, it's had direct seeding of shrubs and some specific pest animal control. I think you can see that, well, unless I've made it up, it looks pretty good. The focus areas. So here's some numbers for you. Direct seeding palatable shrubs, which are uncommon in these landscapes due to past grazing, is a mainstay of the revegetation activities. So we've got 100 sites covering over well over 1,000 hectares of direct seeding. So that's not the reserve size, that's where the actual direct seeding's been. Using over 300 kilograms of local native seed. 80 bird monitoring sites, which have been benchmarked and are getting a follow-up survey happening next year by Chris Aros. We've embarked on the first large-scale noisy miner monitoring program on 50 reserves, and I'll explain that briefly later. Shooting, spot on. Five local rural schools have participated in TSR activities. Grazing management's been improved on around 120 reserves. And interestingly, on most of these, the boundary fences were removed as part of the program, not put up, and stockyards erected. And then finally, active annual woody weed and pest animal control is occurring on 60 plus reserves. African boxthorn's a classic up on the Lachlan, as Martin would know. Right, here are the key things I want to espouse. Learnings for restoration at landscape scale. Experience and knowledge is absolutely vital. I love the reference to historic settings of these places. You know, what the hell was the place like? If you've got that data, that's fantastic. Luckily for me, I expected every one of those reserves with a TSR ranger. So I was able to get a lot of real life, recent history and other stuff from them. There were initial assessments done in the late 90s by a guy called Rick Webster, and along with my 30 years plus of experience in these systems, it helped improve with the priority settings. And for example, a classic is you might go to reserve and it looks tremendous in autumn. You think, oh, this is just wonderful. But huge amounts of grass biomass can be produced at times. And the need for active control to reduce fire risk and suppression of desired species is absolutely vital. So you get swamped by barley grasses and ryegrasses. Invaluable input by rangers with knowledge of site management, history and assistance in realistic goal setting. I was tempted every time I went to reserve to do a plan to write something fantastic. You know, this is going to be incredible. And I kept getting brought back to reality. What can we achieve? So we were taking the things that were obvious, that were relatively simple, and if it was difficult, we just moved on. Instigation of the first major noisy miner culling program. As we stand at present, there's been well over 1,000 culled at 40 sites, and it's still a huge problem. Anyone that's interested in birds in woodland areas, if there's a noisy miner problem there, response by small birds is going to be extremely limited, no matter what the condition of the habitat is. Very important to bear in mind. Invaluable input by rangers with knowledge of site management, history and assistance in realistic goal setting. And I just thought I'd give you a couple of anecdotes to explain why it's so important. I was north of on the Riverina plain, north of Hay, near a place called One Tree. And it's those broad plains you see where you can actually, of an evening, you can actually see the horizons curved. And I was out there with John, ex-drover ranger, and he was telling, I was being, you know, my normal sort of knowledgeable self, saying, oh, isn't it great, look at all these plants. And it was a grassland reserve which had a lot of semi-aquatic species. And I was saying, wow, this is great, this is, you know, how are we going to go here? And he said, look, this is the first time in 50 years it's been like that. The Marule Creek flooded out on the floodplain on what was normally dry grassland, and up came all these plants. Now the reality is that is a once in 100-year occurrence. But me going there on that time was going to make all these judgment calls about, oh, we're going to have this, that and the other. And he brought me back to reality. And you go past there now and there's no semi-aquatics there at all. And then another one, Peter, the guy who was the project manager. There was a mob of cattle out there with being driven around. So normally there are mobs of about 800. and they were really impressed with this particular drover. He was trying to do all the things they suggested, which is very unusual for drovers. And anyway, we followed up a week or two later, and a lot of the shrubs had been knocked over, eaten, killed, and he went through the roof. Anyway, it turns out that 50 extra cattle were added to the mob, and they were been shipped in from Queensland, and they'd been grown up feeding on scrub country, on shrubs. So basically, there was a small group of cattle that were there that were that's what they wanted. Whereas all the other cows, all they wanted to eat was the grass, which is generally what happens. If you've got green grass, that's what they want to eat. The point out of that was you've got to have someone out there looking at these places. And as it stands at the moment, there is a very strong push to actually not have these reserves leased and given to local landowners or other sorts of things, where the absolute best management is to keep them as open systems which occasionally get grazing on. But someone observing those changes, if and when they happen at critical times, like 364 days of the year it's fine, but that one day it isn't. And that's the sort of stuff that we need to advocate strongly for people to be active land managers. And then the last one I was going to say was about fencing. It was an absolute, Martin and I have spent a lot of our lives making sure people put up fences to control grazing. We found in some of these reserves, especially the ones out of the way, that it was actually better to keep the fences away, because the local landholder would have a habit of bringing their cows in and leaving them in there locked in, and no one would be there for...
It's accidental, David.
Yeah. There are a lot of accidents happening there, clearly. But yeah, so that was just something that to me was just, it's not the way it's supposed to be. But anyway, lastly, some key challenges I put to everyone. Collecting data. Wow. Mostly a waste of time at that scale. The way it's done. Like plot data, if you've got a 150 hectare reserve and you go and do, I don't care how big your plot is, and you try and multiply that out and say, because these sites are independent. Every spot you look at has no influence of anything around it. So to me, that was a very, and still, like for this project, I've got to go and do a floristic survey, have a transect and come up with a bunch of species. How that helps the management is at best unclear to me, and so really I think we need to talk a different language when we're talking with land managers. And I very much like this restoration approach where we start talking about the condition of things. This is where it's at, and these are the sorts of key elements, because I think that means a lot more. And for example, like I looked at 800 hectare site which went along the Hay Road, and it varies going through creek lines over hill and up, well, not hills, but slight rises, and really, how many plots would you need in that if you were going to interpret from those plots where to go? Okay, I'm getting the wind up here. The other one is use of surrogates or identifiers. So rangers are able to make rapid decisions based on condition of key surrogates. And the classic, in most cases, was palatable to perennial species. So they can go and look at that and see what the condition's like. Is it self-regenerating? And make decisions on grazing. Last two, out there, it is definitely the climate. So yes, it's a 6-year project, but unless you get rain at the right time, and having an annual 1-year project, expecting you get results, is just a complete joke. And for example, rainfall, if it falls at the wrong time, so we had rain falling at the end of spring and we got good germination, then we had a stinking hot summer that killed all the germination. So the best bet would have been we didn't get the rain. And then lastly, unless we work closely, and this is the real take-home message for me, with the land managers, restoration is fraught. They're in the front line of observing change and continually having to adapt. So not use a set of rules that the textbook lays out. So one thing I do like about the restoration booklet is that it does set out these, but I think we can make a simple version of it that's for land managers, and I'd put that to you guys to start to come up with. Thank you.